Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I'm Deyasini Roy, and I welcome you to Stories of Women's Identity and Social Control on the Team Wise Reviews December 2021 project in association with Oxford University Press. We are seeking submissions of stories, essays, and poems as part of our project. And to know more, please visit www.tellmeastory.biz. I will now quickly introduce our panelists for today evening. Dr. Sharbani Banerjee is an associate professor of English. Her areas of interest include modern and postmodern English literature, American novels, post-colonial studies, Indian English literature, feminist studies, and gender studies. Articles and seminar papers written by her have been published in numerous journals. Dr. Banerjee is the co-editor of the American novel From Hawthorne to Heller, Cultural Contexts and Critical Perspectives, Macmillan Education, 2019. She also presented a paper at an international conference in post-colonial studies at the University of Lille, France. We welcome you, ma'am, and a very good evening to you. We also have Dr. Hatcher joining us today. Dr. Hatcher is professor and Thacker Chair of Theology in the Department of Religion at Tufts University, a scholar of Hinduism in colonial South Asia, and an expert on the life and work of Ishwachandra Vidyasagar. He is author of several monographs, including Hinduism Before Reform, Harvard 2020, and Purja Hinduism, or the Faith of the Modern Vedantists, Oxford 2008. His first book on Vidyasagar, Idioms of Improvement, Vidyasagar and Cultural Encounter in Bengal, was recently reissued from Primus Books 2020. He is also the translator of Ishwachandra Vidyasagar's Hindu Widow Marriage, Columbia 2011, and editor of Hinduism in the Modern World, Routledge 2016. At present, he is completing an annotated translation of Vidyasagar's polemic against high caste polygamy. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Our pleasure having you. We also have Dr. Jyoti Atwal joining us today. She is Associate Professor at Center for Historical Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and Adjunct Professor at Department of History, Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, University of Limerick, Ireland. She specializes in gender history of India in the colonial and post-colonial contexts. Her recent publications include an edited volume on gender and violence in historical and contemporary perspectives, situating India, London Routledge 2020. She has authored Real and Imagined Widows, Gender Relations in Colonial North India, New Delhi, Primus Books 2016. She has been a visiting fellow at various universities across the globe. She is on the editorial board of Women's History Review. We welcome you to today's discussion, ma'am. And I think she's on mute. Okay. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Banerjee to share with us her perspectives on the topic of our session today. Dr. Banerjee? Dr. Banerjee, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. Are you on mute?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I must say, it is an honor to be in the panel with, stalwarts for the like of Brian and Jyoti, who has specialized in this field absolutely. So I am more of a novice here. Though Jyoti was very kind and we had a nice talk some days ago. And we decided, since the time is short, we sort of divided our discussion, and that I would be talking more on the migration aspect, while she would be talking on the other important aspects of widow reality before, today, and what could be the way in the future. Now, when I was going through certain, texts and books about widows, I came to realize that India is famous for the prevalence of sati in the pre Middle Ages, and in the later times, we find that women were forced into, immolating themselves along with their husbands. But in the Vedic times, I found that this practice was actually a symbolic one where the woman would have to lie by the side of her dead husband together, and the people would put a bow and arrow in the hand of the dead husband, and then the wife would be asked to rise up and move away as a symbolic burning of her previous life and entering into a new life. In other words, what I try to say is that Vedic India did not ostracize widows. It was later that gradually in the samhitas, in the later samhitas, that widowed women are being called the most, the most impure and the most, cursed living being in a society, and they were barred from all kinds of religious ceremonies, be it marriages or any other happy occasion. Because there were too many young widows, they were forcefully asked to, you know, they were cut, their hairs were cut, they were forced to wear only white, no colored dressing that would enhance their beauty. They were asked to eat a non-protein diet that meant not only vegetarian diet, but in Bengal I know that women were not allowed to take certain lentils, even certain vegetables that
Yes.
had some kind of protein content that would maybe, ignite their sexual and physical needs, and they would, be ashamed to society. Now this was in the previous times. After the bhakti movement, the time the likes of Mirabai and Chaitanya, Tukaram, Sant Tukaram, what happened was there was the women found, the widowed women of society found a way of redirecting their sexual, emotional, energy towards a more devotional one, where they began to look upon Lord Krishna as the God, the savior of all women in the Indian, landscape. And so gradually they found that they were better off in any kind of religious institution, religious, some temple or an ashram. And hence, little by little, this migratory process began, where, there are these pockets of excess of widow population. It was shocking to know that in the 2001 census, we have 34 million widows in the whole of India alone. And a lot of them are found in Navadvip, in Bengal, in Varanasi or Kashi, and
Kashi. Right.
maximum Vrindavan. And I came across a report by the chairman of the National Commission for Women, Mrs. Girija Vyas, and in that there is a list of. They took a kind of a census. Deyasini, do tell me when my time is up, because being a teacher, once I talk, I go on talking. So do tell me that. So we found that most of the women who were migrating, I was shocked to see that out of the 210 in her list, I think 192 of them were from Bengal, and they were from Navadip, at least the post 1947, post independent India migrations were from Bengal. And the causes of their migration were just a handful, we could count it on our fingers. One was lack of financial stability. They were thrown out of their households. Number two was that they were ostracized in the family. They were brutalized, domestic violence, sexual improprieties, and they could not even, look after their children. So some alone, some with their children, they have all migrated to Brindaban, where they are living on penury. Very little, rupees 8 or 10 per day. They go to the ashram, they sing the Hari Sankirtan, and they get 250 grams of rice and a little bit of lentil, maybe one potato or two. for the whole day to sustain themselves. The lucky ones have a few. Yes, my time is up.
No, no, ma'am, please
Okay.
continue.
The lucky ones have some kind of residential, place to live in, to lie down for the night. But there are many who are lying under some staircase and in some covered veranda, and they are making do in this manner. So the migration part is very, very shocking. And I will come to the legal part when we go to the question and session, that I have been mailed, and I have been also, thinking about the rules and the laws and the situation in society that does not allow these rules to be sort of, not really enacted. They have been enacted, but most of them remain
Correct.
unenforced because of this situation. So this, and in the acceptance of widows and their remarriages, I was actually sharing one or two of my experiences with Jyoti the other day, and she said that you must come out with them. I just want to share with you that my own grandmother, my mother's mother, lost her husband when my mother was only 4 months old. She was a highly educated woman in those days. My mother was born in 1940. My grandmother was a, history honors graduate from Dhaka University. And yet, when her husband died from tuberculosis, her in-laws, also educated, asked her to chop off her hair, and to eat one rice meal a day, and live on fruits and milk the rest of the day. And my grandmother's father refused. He said that my daughter is educated and cannot live this life. So she had to leave her marital residence and come to her parents, where she was well looked after. But the game took a different turn when in 1953 my grandmother decided to remarry. She found a life partner and she wanted to remarry, and they were married in Patna High Court in 1953.
Okay.
But her parents did not see her face after that till the day they died. They completely hacked her out of, and this is post independent India I'm talking about. My grandmother by then was a first class second of Calcutta University, MA in education, and she was a headmistress in a school. And yet she had to hide for 6 months or 1 year before she could join back to her job because of social ostracism, because she was a widow and she had had the dare to marry again. So that these are, important questions. Even today, Brian and Jyoti and Deyasini, I want to tell you that even today, I am getting ready for my daughter's marriage, and I have a very dear cousin sister who is a widow, and my family is telling me that she cannot take part in any of the wedding activities because it is inauspicious. And I have refused and protested, and I am going to get her to do all the puja work, because this is the situation. And
Yeah, absolutely.
when I will continue, when we will go to the question answer session, I think Deyasini, it is time that the next speaker continues from there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very informative and an interesting take on the subject of today's discussion. It's so gratifying to know about your grandmother, and it added a whole lot of color to the discussion. I would now request Dr. Hatcher to take the discussion forward by sharing with us your take on the topic.
Thank you, Deyasini, and thank you, Dr. Banerjee, Sharbani. That was both, intellectually and historically a valuable framework, but then the anecdotes about your grandmother, really powerful illustration of the persistence of the problems that we're talking about today, or gathered to talk about at least. And of course, you can't hear those stories and not think about Ishar Chandra Vidyashagar and his attempt to promote legislation what was thought to be permissive legislation allowing for the legal marriage of Hindu widows. And of course, that's where I've spent a fair amount of my time thinking about that work and translating Vidova Vivaho from the Bangla into English. And I wanted to use that as a kind of takeoff point today for my remarks. And I've got a little prepared text that I want to stick to just so it'll keep me on time. But in the past I've argued. I wrote a short essay called the Shakuntala Paradigm, where I made the case that what Vidyasagar was often trying to do, whether it was in fictional writing like his Shakuntala or in his social reform tracts like Vidova Vivaho, he was trying to get his fellow Bengalis to recognize the plight of Hindu widows, and that plight has just been, illustrated in a nutshell so well by Dr. Banerjee. The kind of ostracism, the kind of asceticism, the kind of status that they are relegated to, and the privations that they faced, and then, of course, the way we think about this is forced upon them. And in part, the problem persists because Ramohan Roy, having succeeded in seeing the abolition of sati, then widows could live their lives out, but what kind of lives did they have? So I've made the argument that Vidyasagar's larger task was simply what I would call it to promote an ethic of recognition, getting Bengalis to recognize the plight that women and widows in particular were subjected to in their family lives. And I think it's a really important way to call attention to the sort of moral impulse behind his work. But in thinking about today's meeting, I was led to think in particular about the legal ramifications of the fallout of the 1856 Act 15 allowing for the marriage of widows, and had to wonder whether it's time to revisit some of this. And so let me just follow through a chain of associations almost that I ran through in my mind. So put it this way: if Vidyasagar could be said to be the heir to Ramohan's work in promoting the welfare of Hindu women, especially wives of widows, I would ask, why is it that Vidyasagar never directly addresses a problem like inheritance and property rights of widows? Ramohan had taken that up. If you remember his brief remarks regarding modern encroachments on the ancient rights of females, according to the Hindu law of inheritance, this was 1822 already. And in that work, he directly raised the question of how women had tended to fare, Hindu women, in relation to changing legal regimes from the ancient period of the lawgivers like Manu and Yajnavalkya to the pre-modern. We would associate the Nibandhas of Dayabhaga and Dayatattva down to the colonial era when he was writing. So he was asking very clearly what had happened, a kind of degradation of what he thought was ancient entitlements for women that had been chipped away over time and that were in danger of being lost to women. This is a powerful critique. And if Vidyasagar is the heir to Ramohan, why is it that he is almost entirely silent on the question of women's property rights? If he was such an advocate for women, why didn't he take this up? I went back and I had to remind myself that Vidova Vivaho, it has all sorts of things to say about inheritance rights for any kind of sons that might be born, natural, adopted, Paunarbhava, Kshetraja, etc. The legal literature is rife with discussion of how those sons can inherit. But that work, dedicated to promoting the right of a widow to remarry, has nothing to say about the widow's inheritance rights. And now, as Deyasini mentioned, I'm working on a translation of Bahuvivaho, and I'm calling it in English Against High Caste Polygamy. Of course, this is a tract against Kulan polygamy. And there too, even though Ramohan, in his writing, had directly linked Kulan polygamy to problems of inheritance, Vidyasagar, again, just stays away from the question of inheritance. And I find that silence rather astounding. Vidyasagar will mention some of the same authors and works that Ramohan mentioned, the Dayabhaga, Dayatattva, but he won't touch the issue of inheritance rights. This is particularly interesting because in Bahuvivaha, Vidyasagar is capable, he shows himself being capable of doing the same kind of historical critique that Ramohan had done, going back to the ancient period, or at least the long ago period of Adishur and Balala Shen, and suggesting how things had changed from Balala Shen to Devi Bharagataka and on down to the present. And so he's able to show how coolant polygamy also degrades and becomes a pernicious social practice. But in all of that, he does not engage in the kind of critique that Ramahan did in terms of suggesting where women have lost out in terms of property rights. So what would that tell us about him? What does it tell us about the colonial transformation of law? And I think Dr. Banerjee's already hinted, we'll come back to some of this. And what does it do for helping us think about him as someone who supported, quote, women's rights? If he worked to promote an ethic of recognition, maybe when I use that phrase, I should modify it and speak only of a limited ethic of recognition. Or maybe I should speak, and we should speak only of a certain recognition of a certain shastrically defined woman. That is not a woman as understood in the modern liberal sense of an autonomous agent with rights, but as someone defined as, we know from texts like the Laws of Manu, always under the protection of and subservient to men, whether it's her father, her husband, or her sons. And if you jump ahead to the age of consent debates at the end of the 19th century, we find again that Vidyasagar fell back on the Shastras to kind of issue an astounding, what do I want to say, deviation from what you would think would be the liberal norm on this. Proved himself, it seems to be rather patriarchal in his views. Patriarchy perhaps shaped by deference to the Shastras. And I think this is just a kind of difficult question that we have to ask of someone like Vidyasagar. My whole career I've largely been dedicated to bringing him to the attention of people in Europe and America who don't know enough about him, help them to understand the enormity of what he did accomplish. And I think he did accomplish a great deal and was an amazing individual. But this session today really allows us to ask some pressing questions about, just what he accomplished. He certainly felt there was a need to allow widows to enjoy the benefits and delights of marriage. He felt marriage was truly the core of the householder's life, and that's something a woman should be entitled to enjoy. This is true from his essay on child marriage all the way through. And he could say that that was a right that was entitled to or granted to women under the Shastras. And maybe even in British colonialist terms, there was a kind of chivalrous quality to his stepping forward to help women have this noble life as wives. But from our vantage point today, of course, that chivalrous defense of women to lock them into subservient roles that, as we know, the upshot of the legislative enactment of Act 15 was to deprive the widow of the property of her deceased husband. So I went back and looked at some of the proceedings from the debates around Act 15. Vidyasagar's name is mentioned in connection to the lieutenant governor who's driving the movement. But Vidyasagar is never mentioned as raising the question of what about inheritance rights. All of this raises the prospect that, as many feminist scholars have shown, that women were largely important as a kind of property, I guess you could say, and that their rights and freedoms were really always subservient to male control over property. And so there's a kind of whole train of arguments about the reinscription of patriarchy under colonial rule. And I think we have to acknowledge that Vidyasagar belongs within that problematic paradigm. So I don't know, maybe, how am I doing, Deyasini, on time?
Yeah, you have 2 more minutes, I guess.
Okay, so I just wonder if we're going to get more into the legal issues.
Okay, you wish to stop here? Or you wish
maybe
to stop?
Maybe I'll pause there, and we can come back to some of the other issues, because this then goes down into the passage of Act 15. So maybe I'll stop.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hatcher, for sharing with us your wonderful insights. Dr. Atwal, could you please offer us your insights on the topic of today's discussion?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharbani and Professor Hatcher. You set the tone for what I'm also going to say. I'm also going to take up from where Professor Hatcher left, that is Vidyasagar, and talk a bit about that. And then the 1856 Act and the further development of that act into 1933 debate on property, which involved where I found, when I was researching, I found some of the very hard to accept evidence from the community and very sharp words going which in the legislative domain, which were unbelievable about women's rights, etc. However, the widows that we when we refer to widows or widowhood, we are referring to mostly what comes to our mind is widows in pilgrimage, widows in the war, widows at home, and widows and work. And when work would mean widows who are probably have no support, but their labor is which is the subject of study. And at home, it is the widows who are at home and laboring at home. This is the informal, organized work that they do, which is, of course, not measurable and is left unaccounted for. When war, we're talking mostly about widows, and a lot of work has been done on war widows in the recent years. And we look at, if we if we plug on to the colonial period, we would know that in Punjab, the area of the rights of widows could not be meddled with. And this is because most of the recruits were soldiers in the army were from the Punjab region. And so on the ground, the customary laws became very strong, and that has its own problems and advantages. So I won't go into each one of them. It's a very vast subject, as you know. So I will just be talking to you, giving you a snippet of how we can look at widowhood and widows in terms of their rights and in terms of the discourses in the past 100 years, which is a challenge. In my book, which was also my doctoral work, and in the book subsequently, I argued that historically, although we have evolved from the debate on dying sati, the sati which you know is chaste woman, because we have come out from that, we have evolved, we have accepted that discourse, we have accepted the legislation on that, we have looked at it. However, we have evolved into an idea of the living sati. That is, if the woman is not dead, then probably she's expected to live like a sati. So sati being a larger canvas on which things can be also we can study it in the sense that she was supposed to be a woman, a widow, was not going to die, but how she was supposed to live was also dictated and decided by, of course, patriarchal forces, economic forces, social forces, etc. So that is one thing which I did. And while trying to do that, I tried to move away from the conventional studies on only the pilgrim widows or widows in migration process, because then you lose their sense of location, because the household that has thrown them out is not visible to you. That also needs to be visible. And there have been very important reports that have come out by the West Bengal Commission in Radha's name, by forgetting the name of the author, but it was a very important report which came out in 2008, and it listed the women who went out. They studied the Vrindavan and Banaras widows, and it was quite an impressive study and in-depth study which brought out the real status. And of course, one is open to visit the ashrams where they sing bhajans and the bhajan ashrams. I wanted to avoid that kind of repetition of that study. So I moved on to a different domain. When we talk about Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, I'll go back to 1850s where Professor Hatcher left. When we go back to this period, we realize that this is a domain which was investigated, where the study is pretty new. in the 1970s, the Marxist scholars, of course, they started looking at the Renaissance period, re-looking at Renaissance period, which had been celebrated in Bengal, and not with an aim to deconstruct the Renaissance, but to revisit and recontextualize it as a Bhadralok experience. And this Bhadralok experience, to situate it as a Bhadralok experience, would mean that Vidyasagar was doing, was actually uh, to be understood in terms of the guilt that the Bhadralok had. And also Ram Mohan Roy was going to be looked at with that view. Anyway, in those terms, I'm not going to go into that, but it became 2 or 3 interesting points which I want to make here about Vidyasagar is that he was very popular, became very popular, and somebody does need to study this kind of public sphere which is created around reform and wove Vidyasagar in it. Because from the experience of researching in UP, in the United Provinces, I came across several reformers who start individual projects and journals stating that they're influenced by Vidyasagar, and one of them is a journal attributed particularly to widow remarriage, and this was called Abla Hitkarak. Abala is a general term for women, which we mean weak, the weak gender. Abala, of course, in the current feminist discourse and awareness, we don't call women abala, rather sabala, but we don't call them abala anymore. But in those days, yes, this is 1905 we're talking about. And Shankar Lal, the editor and owner of Abla Hitkarak, says he ordered a copy of Vidyasagar's Widow Remarriage, which was initially in Bengali. He did not get any translated copy. So he got it in Bengali. He wanted to read the original. Then he started learning Bengali in order to read it. And of course, he imbibed this reform in his own life, because he became a widower during the time when he was running this journal. And this journal actually had advertisements for widows, inviting the widows, remarriage advertisements for like Agarwal widow wanted for an Agarwal widower. Brahmin god widow wanted for a Brahmin god widower. So the caste was not to be broken and forgotten, even while you were remarrying the widows, which was a big step for that period. So when we measure reformism, I think there are so many limitations to that, and Vidyasagar was, of course, full of that. And this Vidyasagar and other reformists have been understood with a larger view that they were probably products of some kind of Victorian reformism, with some kind of prohibition, inhibition, and they aimed at creating a clean society and so on. So aim was not liberation of women, but also the association with the empire, the notion of shame and guilt, and being part of the British Empire. So there are lots of things which have already been said by historians, and a lot of work has been done on this. I won't go into that. But the interesting thing was that this is the reform takes a different form when it travels to different province, and then the other point which I would like to make is that the notion there is a phase in the widowhood studies when you can say there is in terms of rights, when the rights RITS travels to become rights, RIGTS, GHTS. So that is the period from 1856 to 1937. I think that is a major period, which is a breakthrough. And in this, Harbila, Sharda and Deshmukh are very important. They do not use the Vidyasagar kind of argument or Shastras, Samhitas, in favor of widows. And the discourse, the base of reform, the base of remarriage, not only remarriage, but inheritance now, changes to a very secularized domain, saying, let's have sympathy for them. Let's have sympathy for the widows, that now they should not be allowed to forfeit. And this is where the break comes from Vidyasagar to Sharda. That is something actually I have developed, but I have not put it very strongly in my book. That is something which I should in my revised thesis or revised in an article form, I should put it. But for the moment, I think this is a break which has occurred. And here is a break. We did have our own feminist movement, the male feminist movement. And I think it was Harbila Sharda. And Harbila Sharda argues he's a lawyer himself, and he keeps arguing in favor of giving women the same rights as men do and share in the property. Of course, it gets knocked down in 1920s, 29, when he floats the in the Hindu widows property rights bill. It gets shot down. Then because it can't happen. There is a complete shooting down of that immediately. They said, we're not even discussing this in the legislature. Then he reframes it and brings it back in 1933, calling it the Hindu widows' right to maintenance. Because he collects a good amount of data which is there. And I'm so impressed with this whole 1933 debate, which also fails eventually. He's not able to get even a share to maintain the widows. And there were so many arguments. So my aim was to first also tell you that in terms of Kali Yuga and the arguments about this, when Vidyasagar talks about the Kali Yuga, he uses the Samhitas, and he does drive home a point about how there are different rules for different yugs. And I think it's very interesting because such a reformist idea has not been floated in the West, even when it's linked with philanthropy and religion. I think Kali Yuga is a great cyclical idea which he puts forth. However, it aims at maintenance of the caste cycle. It aims at kind of not breaking it. And that is where I think Professor Hatcher would agree with me. That is a problem with this reform, that but it is for that time even. And how many days, how many years the widows of different castes should wait, that differs from each other. So, and how the widow should perform sati, even that differs. Now, I'm just going to go for two more minutes, and then okay, sorry. So because I had prepared slides, I'm so sorry. I'm just pushing through my slides. Yeah. Okay. So the main thing that was handed down as a result of 1933 discussion, which was, I think, by far the most vibrant discussion we've had about Mitakshara and Dayabhaga, the old systems of property, which were intensively discussed. Well, they were discussed, but not in the sense that they could be redone and rethought. They were discussed in the sense, can any widow be given a share and maintenance? So general feeling was the participants were all men in this widowhood debate. They were lawyers, judges. They were lawyers. They were district. They were advocates from other districts and provinces, and they were individual reformists like Sanatan Dharmi, people from some Math, etc. They were brought in for opinion giving about Hindu religion as to will it permit some kind of maintenance or not. And it was clear that Hindu religion was very generous to them. It was very clear. This is what they said, that there is already a provision for it in the Hindu religion, and all widows are treated very nicely in the household. Harbila Sharda countered that by giving them an evidence against it. Said, no, I have seen a lot of widows which are clearly in the paupers in a very bad situation, so you can't say that. So then other argument was floated, which is very interesting for historians, social scientists, that the British government, the colonial government, should not interfere in the Dharam Niti and only do Rajniti. The words used were Dharam Niti versus Rajniti. And there are very clear strictures that are laid down by. So there is almost a public debate that is appearing during 1933, which I think we can talk about. I'm going to move on. And to my last, and also, of course, Varnashram was very important, central to Sanatan Dharmis. Okay, the other issue was about the converted widow. Actually, widow who converted did not become too much of a problem because by the 1850 Act, I'm just finishing in 2 minutes. By the 1850 Act, uh, it was permitted for any individual, any member of any person who was a Hindu or Christian or Muslim to convert to another religion and not lose any property right in their family or their joint property, etc. Uh, this right disturbed a lot of groups, communities, but at the same time, it remained where it is. It could be invoked by individual. So this was actually Disability Removal Act. So any widow who, suppose she married a Muslim man, she remarries a Muslim man, a Hindu widow, her right to the Hindu men's ex-deceased husband's property remained the same, and that added to the whole debate. And of course, the question of chastity. What if she remarries? If she remarries, it's okay, but not within outside the caste, etc. So I think a lot of these things will keep coming as we discuss more. This is something which I have discussed, but more issues are there to be discussed. One is, in reality, the inheritance rights are there, but they are usually suppressed. And widows have to be, as Veena Agarwal has laid down, the widow has to be treated has to be given property as a daughter, not only as a wife. And there is social stigmatization, which should, of course, we need to be addressed. Then strong public welfare policies also regarding the abandoned women, because a lot of these women on the pilgrim sites are abandoned. I interviewed 50, 60 of them in Vrindavan and about 20 in Banaras during my early days of research. And I found that they were all duped into coming there. The family told them they will come and collect them after 2 months and so. So they have been there since then. So thank you very much. And I look forward to your comments and more discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that extremely interesting and enlightening take on the subject. I now move on to the question and answer segment. And my first question is to Dr. Hatcher. Dr. Hatcher, there are two major dimensions of social change, its nature and direction. While the nature reveals the content of change, the directions speak about in which line it is moving. True to the above statement, how would you justify widow remarriage as a new epistemology of social change, challenging the cultural perception of widowhood, given that widow remarriage is both a potential solution and a profound problem? In a way, widows become an object of heightened vulnerability even after remarriage? And could we say, standing today, that the legacy of the great humanitarian, educationist, and visionary of Indian history, Vidyashakur, lives on, considering the reformist motives and cultural preservation and practices of the present Indian societal system? Does it reaffirm the claim that history is only golden in books and not amongst the ordinary?
I missed the last bit of what you said. I think it just froze a little bit. Could you say the last phrase? Does history...
Does it reaffirm the claim that history is only golden in books and not amongst the ordinary?
Yes. No, I appreciate that question. It goes to the heart of how we make sense of figures like Vidyashankar and Rammohn Roy even, and the various reform moments throughout the 19th century, which I think we justly celebrate for the direction, as you put it. The direction of change was to open up the possibilities for, in this case, Hindu women, but at the same time, the nature of choices made, sort of strategic choices made, carried with them real long-lasting implications, some of which brought about unintended consequences, because I think I've tried to make the case, and you're often fighting multiple battles at the same time. So there was a long-standing kind of dismissal of Vidyashankar in some scholarly circles for his over-reliance on Shastra, and that he was somehow a slave to Shastra and had not achieved a kind of modernity that was robust enough to think outside of scripture. And I found that to do a disservice to Vidyashagar's intellect and to his strategic vision. And so my attempt in the translation of Hidden Widow Marriage was to make a case that what he did was not, he wasn't enslaved to Shastra as much as he saw the possibilities of taking pre-modern commentarial practices and legal exegesis and yoking them to a new way to think about a present day problem such as the plight of the unmarried Hindu widow. Now, so he's taking the tools of tradition that are given to him, and he's trained as a Sanskrit pundit, so it's natural to him to have these tools in his toolbox. And that provides him with a way to kind of reinvigorate his traditional resources. And it provides him with a way to actually succeed in his legislative endeavor. But at the same time, having chosen those tools, he's committed himself to a certain paradigm of which I think contributes by the end of the 19th century to a kind of culturalism, to a kind of celebration of Shastra, and a kind of notion of the sanctity of a kind of dharmic view of the world, which then, for the reasons I was saying in my comments, it sort of limits the possibilities for a Hindu woman because she's now kind of been told you will be defined within and have your rights achieved according to what the Shastras tell us. And so now we have a problem. And this is the same with, I'm glad that Dr. Atwal mentioned the theme of Kali Yuga, because Vidyashagar was famous for invoking Kali Yuga as the argument for why, say, the verse from Parashara could be operative in the case of widow marriage. So he uses this again in Bahu Vivaha, I noticed. So for him, this is a powerful tool to get over some of the legacy of tradition, which he feels is handicapping change. But at the same time, the discourse of Kali Yuga, as Dr. Atwal mentioned, is kind of loops us back into certain notions of the preservation of a kind of Hindu casteist universe. And so, we're taking steps forward. The directionality is progressive, we could say, but some of the strategic choices are going to be limiting and leave us with problems that will come up later. I'm glad the idea of the Abala was mentioned as well, because this is Abala Bandhu, Vidyashagar is the friend of the powerless. Well, there again, it's a noble epithet for him, but it's also a disempowering epithet for a woman to treat her as the powerless, who needs the male, demonical, respectable figure to help her achieve a limited version of liberty. So there's a number of things in here. I think we could talk about the legacy of the British decision under Hastings to administer Hindu law by the Shastra and Muslim law by the Sharia, the notion of personal law, and the decision then to have certain realms of religious law be operative, which seems to immediately preclude the possibility of achieving any kind of secular framework within which rights and liberties could be defined regardless of scriptural mandates. So that's a whole legacy that people were having to, people like the Vidyashagar were having to work within. A lot of other notes I took during the Dr. Banerjee's and Dr. Atwal's presentation, but maybe is that enough for now in terms of answering your question? Because I don't want to take up all the air.
Do you wish to stop here?
Maybe I'll pause there and let others respond if they want. Or do you have other questions for them?
Yes, I have other questions for them. Dr. Hatcher. So moving on, my second question is to Dr. Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee, it is substantiated by a majority of findings that millions of widows routinely experience violations of their property and inheritance rights, and even face an array of procedural and practical hurdles in the face of claiming it. With so many movements, sensitization programs and reforms in both the personal and public sphere, paving way in psychological, philosophical, socio-ecological domains, why do you think there is no legal flexibility for a widow pertaining to the issue? And why does she even have to bear the headache of legal complications, and fight for a right that is unquestionably hers when most abuse goes undocumented, and perpetrators who leave her without a roof unpunished.
Thank you, Deyasini, for that very relevant question today. In this case, I asked this same question to my husband, who is a judge. So he is always dealing with legal practices that is going on today. So what I when I was studying on this and looking up the acts previously, as Professor Jyoti Atwal mentioned, right from 1856, 1874 was the first time when women were allowed, at least the right to enjoy the property till their lifetime, They did not have the right to acquire it. And then in 1937, of course, gradually these things were changing. And today, of course, finally, in 2005, we have the Prevention of Domestic Violence Against Women. And a part of that includes uh, uh, widowed and divorced women who have the right to reside in their husbands or in their post-marital residence without any kind of clause. But as you say, that they have to constantly, because the moment a husband dies, if there are other parties to the property, maybe money in the bank or house or land, these are movable and immovable properties, immediately the other inheritors count her as an excess. This mindset has not yet come, that even if the son is dead, the wife is a part of the son and a part of the property. And what happens? The rules of the land today empower the widow to inherit her husband's property. Also, supposing if the husband had predeceased his father, supposing for a young widow, her husband is dead, but her father in law is alive. And he is the owner. Father in law is the owner of the property, whatever it may be. When he dies, the widow has a right to 1/6 of the share of the father-in-law. Now that is all there in the rules, but why does it take so much to is it so difficult, and why are the widowed women marginalized and peripheralized just because they are claiming their share? It is almost as if they are, it is a taboo to claim for what belongs rightfully to you. Now, in this case, particularly for the case of the widows, what happens is, because the rules of the land empower the widow, what the marital family does is they, misbehave with them, domestic violence, misdemeanor, to such an, even only physical torture is not the only torture. Psychological, as Jyoti was talking about the
Absolutely.
caste setup. There are caste-based problems. Supposing the boy had married out of caste, the marriage was accepted. The moment the boy, the son is dead, this woman is ostracized, often thrown out of the household, or done in such a way she is made to live without food, she is not spoken to, which almost provokes her to leave the household. So these are kind of psychological, debarment from the woman's rights to acquire property. So there is a catchment area between the rules of the land and the implementation of those rules. And that is where, panel discussions like this come in handy, because the Indian constitution has, passed this legal, act by which any woman, whether she is a widow or whether she's a married woman, has the right of free legal service. A woman, if she goes, if she applies for a legal service free of cost, she is allowed that, and the state will run the case for her and see to it that. But how many women are aware of this? So this catchment,
Right.
the call of the day today is to, to close this catchment area between the rules and the awareness. Of course, today when we are talking in 2021, whether it is a widow or a married woman, and another thing, it also implies the divorced women as well, these laws. So the widows and the divorced women are often taken into consideration. And if a widow has inherited her husband's property, and after that, if she marries, that property cannot be taken away from her. That is the rule of the land. But what happens is that these Legal Services Authority Act that was passed in 1987, and which has been enforced since 1995, remains, it, though there is free legal aid for women, but women are mostly not aware of this. And our country being such a vast one, there are so many cases going on, just as a case between two brothers when they're fighting for property after their father's death. It can carry on for 10 years, 20 years. Same is the case for widows. The malaise is not with the rules but with the implementation. And what happens is when a widow is when a girl is fighting for her father's property, that is not so much a case for ostracism as a widow fighting for her husband's property. She is blamed to be greedy, she's blamed to be acquisitive, she's blamed not to be mourning for her dead partner and running after her property. Her needs of sustenance, her needs of a livelihood, her necessity of bringing up her children and living in a respectable manner. Not all women want to remarry, not all women wish to,
Right.
latch on to another man only to be sustained. So
Right.
this is, that is, I believe, is a lack of social awareness that is still there, even in this, techno savvy, in this internet bonanza that is going on. We know who is sneezing where, who is sleeping where, but we are the women today. Many, I believe, 90% of the women are still unaware of the provisions that are there in the code. And why the cases take, so why they have to fight is that, when it is a case of property, and if that, the demand for that property gets nasty, there is no other way but to go to court. And the court procedure takes a very long time everywhere. That is one of the, major concerns today, that many women actually relinquish their rights for fear of having to fight a 10-year, 15-year legal battle at court. But they can do it with the help of Legal Services
Right.
Authority Act that is there, and they can apply for it in any of the high courts or district judges court, and they will be, you know, they will gain help, and it will run in a smoother manner for that.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am, for that extremely enlightening answer. Yes, indeed, our limited focus has, kind of left a major lacuna in our understanding of these processes. And
Yes.
it's high time we look into these matters with informed understanding and sensitivity. Okay, so I now move on to my next question. And my next question is to Dr. Jyoti Atwal. And I wanted to bring another important aspect into discussion and hence a question. Uh, so, Dr. Atwal, apart from the Widow Remarriage Act, there were also other bills introduced in colonial India to promote some degree of autonomy for women, such as the Post Puberty Marriage Bill, which also sparked debates. How did all these provisions taken together affect the perception of bodily and sexual autonomy of women in colonial India? And also, was the degree of resistance varied according to caste identity? As practices like pre-puberty marriages were much more prevalent in Brahmin and upper caste communities. What do you have to say in this regard?
Yeah, thank you, Deyasini. Thank you very much. Yeah, of course. Acts such as Child Marriage Restraint Act and Age of Consent, which also that is what it became later on, and its reformulation, its alteration is very important. The age of consent has had a long history in India, and I think it's when it starts in 1891, a lot of other things are happening. There's a kind of a different notion of resistance movement in India that is building up, but yet there are intellectuals who are lined up at around this time, and the nature of reform becomes very different. And I think a lot of people have written about it. Charles Hemseth has written, Kenneth Jones. They've written, they've addressed this question of reform, and I mean, we have one of the main authorities with us here, Professor Hatcher. Uh, he has a big contribution into this field. So I think there is a substantial evidence to show that this is not it's not a linear process reform, that in 1856 this happened and then this had to happen. It's a very painful process. There is also then it is interrupted by the early nationalists, because Indian National Congress says that around the 1890s, it's around the late 1890s, it settled that the Social National Conference will not happen along with the political Indian National Congress. So the political and the social will be separated, and this became a problem. At the same time, it came out of the political domain, the question of social reform. Um, and I think Partha Chatterjee has also talked about this. But the main thing is that it was then left to the individual communities to reform. Let's say find widow remarriage, do this, and say, okay, we are now happy, we'll do it ourselves. We don't want any interference from the colonial government. So anti-colonial movement did impact this anti-reform movement, and that is towards the late turn of the century. We were going into a very different direction. At the same time, well, there is always I do not like to use the word secular and religious and reformists and revivalists, and it can be very easily understood in those categories, but I think we have we have learned how to problematize those. Yes, bills, again, Harbila Sharda is again very instrumental. 1891, Fulmani Dasi, everybody is very, very familiar with the case of Fulmani Dasi, 11-year-old girl, raped and bled to death. And that is an example when that's the first case when it makes entry into the public domain, sets the reformist efforts on fire, because after almost 100 years, you still have rape, you still have rape within marriage, and people have not learned, and it is like it's a murder, whether you burn it or rape her and kill her, whatever. So it shocked the public, and I think that shock absorber has been, the reformers have kind of tried to absorb the shock, and they have again resorted to colonial government, the legal aspect, because they know it can't be there can be no dialogue within the Hindu community, and one has to sort out this problem, and there should be some intervention from like in Sati. I think they were very happy that at least Sati has has declined after the act, and although there were very different reasons, which Lata Mani has discussed in a book. I would still go ahead and talk about the property rights, which are very important. Of course, caste, you have asked me. Yes, let me come to the caste first. I think caste is very important here, because, as I mentioned, the option to remarry was within the caste, and the reform which we are talking about, which Sharbani referred to as, the problems of the main problems about, how the women will never open her mouth against the brothers or, or the relatives to seek any redressal from the law, any legal redressal, is very true even till today. Educated or not educated, caste, whichever, it's across the caste and education and class. But at the same time, yes, this is very important, that one has to know that Punjab is very different from Bengal. We have a very different model emerging in Punjab. And that I always talk about Punjab, because completely different from Bengal. In Bengal, the question of chastity was a ground on the basis of which the rights could be denied. It was built into the 1856 Act. That is the
Yes.
problem.
Yes.
56 Act said forfeiture if she's unchaste, or it left it so open ended. And there's nothing even Vidyasagar could do about it. Poor chap, he didn't know what to do about it. So he was absolutely, but in Punjab there was forced remarriage, which
Okay.
Yes.
was
Oh,
within the community, which is
okay.
which is a completely different model from what Bengal is. In
Absolutely.
Bengal there is Daya Bhaga, so there's a fear
Yes.
that if this woman comes back and asks for shares, better pack her bags and send her off to Banaras. You know,
Yes.
and what if she really comes back? I mean, I don't know. There is something more going on in Bengal, which Ashish Nandi talks about some psychological reasons for that, and there's this very complex story in Bengal. But in Punjab, it's slightly simpler because the customary laws cannot be interfered with. Because all the soldiers who have gone on war have to, if they die, there should be no confusion about who should get the inheritance in that case. So it was settled in 1920s and 1919. This debate opens up. So they're not relying on these acts or 1933 Property Act and other acts. They already have, the British government is covering them in amongst the larger widows of the empire, the pensions which come, because they want to make everybody eligible for pensions. How will you deny a pension to somebody
Yes,
who
true.
is remarried? She has to remarry because that is a rule, customary rule. So that thing had to be reversed. How do you deal with that? It's very interesting how the Punjab model is very different, and therefore you will see no agitation from Punjab because British government say yes to everything. They said, well, they're soldiering, no way we are going to interfere in. There's a fear that if they will interfere, but in the Punjab economy and society is ridiculous, was ridiculous in different ways because of its anti and the feticide, female feticide, etc. They're also called the Kodi Mars, which has been covered by so many. Vina Oldenburg has written about this Kudi March. She was herself a victim of that, widow burning, the dowry burning. So dowry is very, very important thing. So when we talk about intersectionality, widowhood enters intersectionality in when it comes to free India, and it's very difficult to resolve that because caste is involved, class is involved, regionality is involved, individuality is involved. Women, if the woman belongs to a trading class, even then, she can hire somebody to go for her and fight the case. But in case of a peasant woman who has probably acres and acres of land, she can't. She will have to depend on the men in the house for that. Although proper ownership of property itself doesn't assure confidence. So anyway, I think that's what you asked. Maybe I have not answered, or maybe I have, because you said caste, pre-puberty marriages, of course, child marriage. In any case, there are
Yes.
a lot of cases. Hospitals churn out cases in the late 19th century, and we have abundance of. There are several volumes of 1929 Age of Consent Act from different areas, provincially done. So there is no dearth of any evidence. Yeah. Thank you if I have answered that.
Now, I think I
Yes.
just want to add on to what Jyoti says, and she's absolutely correct. That is what I found out from the National Women's Commission, census, that they took a cross-section interview of widows, and out of them, as I told you, that there were 192 were Bengali out of 210 or 214. So that was, shocking to me as a Bengali myself, because I mean that shows that we have dealt with our widows in the most deplorable fashion. Otherwise, this migration would not have taken place. And most
Right.
of them are saying that more than 50% of them are saying that they have come of their own accord. But the other 50% are saying they were brought by their families as if they are going on a tour, on a religious tour, kind of a pilgrimage, that their minds will be better, they will be able to manage the loss of their husbands, and then they are left and simply they go away. They are abandoned. this. And I just want to recall, since Jyoti was also talking about 1856 and even before that, in those times, before the Bengal Renaissance began, in Bengal, even in aristocratic families, young widows, because there was the mortality rate for men was very low. I mean, mortality rate was high. They died at a very young age. Now, the widows, they were beautiful. Even you know that Rabindranath Tagore's Chokher Bali, the novel, deals with this problem of the widow, this beautiful widow, and how a family and a marriage are wrecked because the man is so enamored with the widow, and the widow also, she gives a voice to her sexual and emotional necessities. So in Bengal, this kind of proliferation was too much, and there have been incidents in Bengali novels I have read myself that when the widow suffers the attention of the male, it is not the widow's fault. She is covered by a white sari. She has a covering on her head. And yet the male folk maybe are looking at her with lustful glances. It is assumed to be the fault of the woman. Against her wishes, she is often, put into a sack, tied up like a sack of potatoes, and she is put on a steamer or a boat and sent to Kashi, that is modern Banaras. And often sometimes, and even the film Water spoke about this, how from there women trafficking also became apparent. So I agree with Jyoti that the Bengal question of widowhood, I think, is much more serious than a greater part of India.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. And thank you, Dr. Atwal, for that really wonderful answer. And my heartiest thanks to all of you for sharing your valuable time and wisdom for a project. It was a pleasure having you all amongst us today. And this is to state that we are seeking submissions of stories, essays, and poems as part of our project in association with Oxford University Press. And to know more, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Bye bye and stay safe, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
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 you.
you.
you. Thank you.
Very
Wonderful to
Thank you,
see
It
everyone.
Deyasini.
was
Thank
wonderful. Yes.
Yeah.
Great to see you.
So
Keep
thank you,
in touch.
Destiny.
Yes,
Yes,
Keep in
keep
everyone
touch.
keep in
in
touch,
touch.
please. So eager to hear